Good evening, Key City Church. It is so fantastic to be here with you guys this evening. If you're joining us for the first time, we are so happy to have you here and invite you to just make yourself at home. And if there's anything that you need tonight, feel free to stop anybody who has one of the name tags on a lanyard. They would be more than happy to help you out. My name is Thomas Pentony, and I'm one of the pastors here at Key City Church. And if you notice, there were a group of kids in the back with us during the music portion who come in and join us for the music. Those are part of our KC Kids program. So if you have kids between the ages of infants through elementary school, I just invite you and encourage you to follow the hallway around to the KC Kids programs back there. We have an amazing team of leaders who would be more than happy to show you around or answer any questions that you have about the program there. And in case you didn't know, we are a brand new community. We just started meeting together weekly last Sunday, so this is only our second Sunday, and we know how important it is for you guys to feel and get connected, and so we want to make that as possible and as easy for you as we can. So near you on the chairs, you'll find KC Connect cards, where if you want to stay in touch with us, keep up with what we're doing, or if you want to get connected to one of our groups or our teams, please use that card. And if you drop that card off with your information for us to keep up with you and stay in touch with you out in the lobby, we'll give you a t-shirt in exchange for your card. You can also keep up with us through our website, keycitychurch.org. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube as well. Next Sunday, we will be meeting at 5 p.m., just like this Sunday. The only difference is we won't be meeting here. We'll be meeting next Sunday in Baker Park at the pavilions by the pool. And the reason is that New Spire Arts, who's just so wonderful to host us, had an event already scheduled for next Sunday before we set up our agreement here. So we're going to leverage that as an opportunity for us as a community to connect together in ways that we might not be able to here on Sunday evenings during services. We're going to share a meal together in the park. And we would love to have all of you guys and all of your friends and your family there with us. So if you'd like to let us know that you're coming, again, you can use the KC Connect cards near you on the chairs, or you can let us know on our Facebook event, and you can find us on Facebook at Key City Church. Well, last week we started into a brand new message series called Faith for Freedom, and this is a 6-week conversation where we are exploring and unpacking the concepts of faith and freedom, because for a lot of us, the faith that we grew up in, the faith that we were introduced to, and maybe even for some of us, the faith that we ended up walking away from was a version of faith in which faith and freedom were antagonistic concepts. They were concepts that didn't go together, where you could have faith or you could have freedom, but you couldn't have both. And for a lot of us, that was our experience, where in order to align with the version of faith that you grew up with or were introduced to, there were things that you had to give up that maybe you enjoyed doing or you liked doing or you got used to doing that you had to stop. And there are new things that you'd never done before that you had to start doing. And you had to trade in some freedom to align with that version of faith. And then some of you have had the experience where you were aligned with a version of faith, the version of faith that you were introduced to, and you wanted to have some more freedom. There were things that you saw people doing that you wanted to do too. And it meant that you were going to have to violate some aspect of your faith to exercise that freedom. And so you withdrew from your faith account to invest in your freedom account. And over time, you found that there was this antagonism, this tension between faith and freedom. And that's what we're talking about in this series. And if you weren't with us last week, I would encourage you to go back and watch last week's message online. You can find it on our YouTube channel, Key City Church on YouTube, and catch up with what we've been talking about and where we left off. But just to provide you a quick recap so that today makes sense to you, what we recognized last week, and we recognized this just because we're people and we have lives and we experience these things, and we just, from our experience, we just know this. And what we know is that we were meant to be free, that you were, I was, all of us were meant to be free. And we know this because we like to be free, right? We like to do what we want to do, when we want to do it, how we want to do it, where we want to do it, as long as nobody gets hurt, right? We like to be free. And being free doesn't just mean that we do the easy thing. It doesn't mean that we're just lazy and impulsive all the time. That sometimes we freely choose to do hard things. Like you take on projects, you do work, you do things that you freely choose to do. And what we all know from doing those hard things freely is that when we freely choose to do something, not only do we work harder at it, not only do we work longer at it, but we enjoy doing it more. We walk away from it feeling more invigorated and whole and complete because we were meant for freedom. And we know we were meant for freedom because we've experienced, all of us, maybe even more than experiencing freedom, we've experienced the opposite of freedom. And we know that too because we know how to get someone to do the things that they won't freely choose, right? We know. The way we do that is you make them, right? It's control. And so whatever we don't do freely, we do by control. And control is simply the approach of finding the right threat or the right reward to override someone's freedom to get them to do what they wouldn't freely choose. We understand control because we lived with people who control. And we recognize that in relationships, the resource that's leveraged to threaten or reward, to get people to do what they wouldn't freely choose, often is acceptance and approval. That we'll withhold acceptance and approval if somebody doesn't do what we want them to do, and we'll reward them with acceptance and approval if they do what we want them to do. And a lot of us have had relationships with that. And a lot of us have had relationships characterized by that. And what we've found over time is that control is leveraged, control is used because it works fantastically, right? It works great. You can get people to do a lot of stuff by leveraging control. But the problem is, control always comes with a cost. The control always comes with a cost. And it comes with a cost because control always incites fear of the threat or fear of missing out on the reward. Control always results in fear, incites fear, and fear always undermines trust. And the result is that when we're confronted with control, we'll respond in one of two ways. We'll either resist it and push away from it because we don't like to be controlled, or we'll resign ourselves to it. And when we resign ourselves to someone or someone's control, eventually we'll resent it. It's why you don't like to spend time with your parents that much anymore, because over time, that control that they were exerting, you just got tired of being around. It's why you don't spend time with that friend anymore that was just so manipulative and so controlling. You just resented it over time. And ultimately, if you continue to resign yourself to it, that resignation to someone or someone else's control, that resignation will ultimately lead to disintegration, where you not only feel like you've lost your freedom, but you feel like you've lost a part of yourself. And for a lot of us, the version of faith that we grew up with, or the version of faith that we were introduced to, was a control-based version of faith that worshiped a control-based God who imposed a standard for what you have to believe and how you have to behave. And because it was something that no one would freely choose to do, God imposed punishments for if you do it or don't do it, and rewards for if you do what he wants you to do. There are punishments and rewards. And on top of that, well, God's approval of you depended on you doing what God wanted you to do. That if you do what God tells you to do, then God will be pleased with you. But if you don't, well, then he won't. And that was what you grew up with. That's what you were introduced to. And for a lot of us, that's why you resisted faith in the first place. It was control-based. You didn't want to have anything to do with it. For a lot of us, it's why we eventually walked out and walked away, because we resigned ourselves to it, but over time started to resent it. And eventually that resignation caused disintegration. We didn't feel like we had just lost our freedom. It felt like we were losing ourselves. And where we left off last week was recognizing not only have some of us walked away from that version of faith, but Jesus' first century followers were walking away from that version of faith, because somehow, in some way, Jesus had come to invite us into a version of faith in which he resolved the tension between faith and freedom. That somehow Jesus had come and was offering us a version of faith that didn't cost us freedom, but was meant to provide freedom. A version of faith that wasn't by control, it wasn't by constraint, but it was a version of faith that removed control and removed constraint and set us free. In fact, one of Jesus' first century followers who had come out of that background, who was one of the most legalistic, controlling religious leaders, who was actually persecuting followers of Jesus, a man named Paul, who was persecuting followers of Jesus until he met the resurrected Jesus and became a follower of Jesus. Paul wrote to a group of followers of Jesus who were falling back into the old ways of control and rules and legalism. Paul writes them this letter and pleads with them. It is not for rules, it is not for control that Jesus came. Instead, he said this. He said, it is for freedom. It's for freedom that Christ has set us free. That Jesus didn't come to exert control. The problem that Jesus was addressing was not a problem of people who were too free that needed to be controlled. The problem that Jesus was addressing were people that were too controlled that needed to be set free. And if that made you, if you grew up in a version of faith where that concept made you just feel just a little bit nervous, right? A little bit nervous, like, yeah, I see what you're saying, but like we don't mean like complete freedom, right? There's still going to be like some control, right? Because if people are too free, I mean, they'll do whatever they want, won't they? And if that concept, if that idea made you feel a little bit nervous, then I think Jesus would say, good, because that concept of freedom made some of his first century followers a little bit nervous. In fact, it was why some of them wavered between the freedom that Jesus was offering and the control and legalism of the Judaism that they had left. It was why they wavered, and it was why some of them were drifting back to that. And so if that concept of complete freedom and lack of control makes you feel a little bit nervous, I think Jesus and his first century followers, and I think Paul would all say, good, maybe, just maybe, it's getting through to you. Because that was the tension they meant for us to feel. And if we feel that tension, if you feel that tension, if we were to put that tension into a question that we could have a conversation about tonight, that question might be this. If Jesus didn't come to impose control, wouldn't we just spiral out of control? I mean, if Jesus didn't come to put in place some kind of control, wouldn't we all just spiral out of control? And we might be worried about that. And we might feel nervous about that. But Jesus didn't feel nervous about that. And Jesus' first century followers and the eyewitnesses of the life and the teachings of Jesus were not nervous about it a bit, because they knew that Jesus had something much better, much more effective, and much more transformative than control. And according to one of those eyewitnesses, a man named John, who had spent 3 years walking with and spending time with and listening to and learning from and listening to the stories of Jesus, spent 3 years watching and listening to Jesus. And 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, 40 years later, John, after reflecting on and thinking about and praying over the life of his friend Jesus, knew that, like, how could I not write this down? Like, I've seen too much, I've heard too much to not write this down. John writes an account of the life of his friend Jesus, which you can find in the New Testament portion of your Bible, not so coincidentally named John. John writes an account of the life of his friend Jesus. And here's how he starts it out. He says, in the beginning, to which his first century readers would have been like, in the beginning? Wait, in the beginning is how our Bible starts. In the beginning is how the Old Testament, the first line of the first book that we call Genesis in the Jewish scriptures starts. They're like, why are you starting your account of Jesus' life the way that our scripture starts? And John's like, well, I'm calling your attention back to something. I'm calling your attention back to the God who created all things, the God who created everything. And not an argument for how God created. This isn't an argument about six-day creation versus evolution versus old earth versus young earth. Like, Jesus' first century followers had no interest in any of those arguments. John was like, I'm not talking about how God created, I'm just talking about the God who created. The God who created everything and created you and me in his image. That's who we're talking about, and that's who John was pointing their attention back to. And they got it. They understood that John was referencing and paralleling the way that their scriptures started. And he says, in the beginning, but instead of saying in the beginning God, he says, in the beginning was the Word. And word comes from a Greek word that means logos, which was a Greek concept. It was a Greek concept about that the underlying framework of reality that holds all things together. It is like the thing that just permeates all of reality and connects everything together. That's what it meant in the Greek. And the Jews had adopted this concept of logos. And to the Jews, logos was the thing, the entity, the concept that united human and divine and brought about unity and freedom. That the Logos concept was that which united human and divine and would ultimately bring about unity and freedom. And John's saying, that Logos was in the beginning. It was always there. But John, what was it? He says, well, the Word, the Logos, it was with God. It wasn't just with God. The Word was God. Wait, John, you're saying that this word concept, it almost sounds like you're making this word into a person. And you're not only making this person similar to God, but you're making them equal to God. John's like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. Because here, look at this. He says, because the Word, the Logos that was God, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we've seen his glory. This is John saying, look. That which was God from beginning, that God, the Word, the Logos, that which unites human and divine and brings unity and freedom, that Word, that God has come and put on flesh to show us exactly what he's like. Which if we could sit down and have a conversation with John and learn from him, we'd all want to know the same thing, wouldn't we? That if you met God in a bod, God in flesh, God who's come to show us what he's like, if you had the opportunity to see what God's like face to face, eyeball to eyeball, what was he like? And John says, we've seen his glory. The glory of the one and only. Yeah, the one and only. Like, we get it. There's only one God. There aren't other gods. But the one and only. But what was he like? And those of us who grew up in a control-based version of faith, we already have an expectation for what God's like. We're wondering, like, what was he like? He was ticked off, wasn't he? Was he upset? Was he upset much? He was angry, wasn't he? Did he add some more rules? He saw what we were doing. He added rules. Did any of those rules have my name on them? Right? Were any of them because of me? Like, what was he like? John says, well, he came from the Father. And we're like, yeah, John, we get it. We get it. The Word became flesh. You've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father. Like, you've got our attention. You met God face to face. Now, what is he like? And John says, well, he was full of grace and truth. That God, the Creator God who created all things and created us to be like him, has come to show us what he is like. And he's full of grace and truth. And grace comes from the Greek word aletheia, which means God's unmerited favor. God's unmerited favor. His unmerited, unconditional, unearnable, unlosable favor and acceptance. It's God's arms open wide, saying, I favor you. I accept you. My unconditional, unmerited, unearnable, unlosable acceptance and approval of you. And truth Truth, which just comes from the Greek word aletheia. Did I say aletheia for grace? Grace is kairos. Truth is aletheia. You just keep me honest here, Clayton. Aletheia, truth, which means the making known of something previously unknown, the revealing of something that was previously covered. That Jesus came to make God known to us. That the God who created us to be like him, and us who lost track of what God was like and became very unlike God, that God then became like us to show us exactly what he is like, and he's full of grace. He's full of unconditional, unearnable, unlosable, unmerited acceptance and approval. And John goes on. He says, for the law was given through Moses. To his first century readers, he's like, remember the law? And they're like, yeah, we remember the law. He's like, remember how the law became the standard that you had to live up to for God to be pleased with you? And they're like, yeah, remember how the law was the standard for what you had to believe and how you had to behave in order for God to be pleased with you? Yeah. And we remember how that standard became the barrier between us and God because it was something that we could never keep up with. And it was something that we could never live up to. It was something that we could never quite reach, and always created this sense of disappointment between us and God, that we were never what he required us to be. And it became something. It became a standard that kept us out and kept us away until we eventually walked out and walked away. Yes, John, we remember the law. We remember the standard. We get it. And John says, well, the same way that the law and the rules to be followed came through Moses, in the same way, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. In the same way that Moses brought laws and rules for you to follow, Jesus has come to invite you to follow him. That Jesus has come and taken the standard of what you had to live up to and what you had to do to make God pleased with you, the standard for what you had to believe and how you had to behave, the standard that had kept so many people out and kept so many people away, the standard that had caused people to walk out and walk away or never walk in to begin with. Jesus had taken the standard and set it on the floor and opened the door and said, now come to me. Come to me. Everybody's invited. Everybody and anybody, regardless of what you believe and what you behave. Jesus opened the doors wide and invites everybody not to follow a list of rules, but to follow him. That Jesus came and said, no more standard. The doors are open wide. And I'm welcoming anybody, everybody, regardless of what you believe, regardless of what you behave, not to follow a list of rules, but to follow me. And Jesus' invitation to follow him, the invitation that he gave during his 3-year ministry, the invitation to the crowds, to the sinners, to the tax collectors, to the adulterers, to the wealthy and the well-off, to the ones who felt like all the opportunities of life had passed them by, to the ethnically marginalized minorities, to everybody, to slaves and the free. Jesus' invitation to all of them was follow me. Follow me. It wasn't like, follow me, let's have a meal together. It wasn't, follow me, let's spend some time together. It wasn't, follow me, let's hang out. It was all of those things and more. Follow me was Jesus' invitation, not just to follow him, but to become like him. Jesus' invitation of follow me was an invitation to become like me. Jesus was continuing the arc of the narrative of Scripture that had begun with in the beginning. That the in the beginning God that created you and me and all of us to be like him, the God that intended us to be just like him, that also watched us lose sight of what he was like and watched us become very unlike him, that God had shown up with skin on to show us exactly what he was like, that we would actually like him. That when we actually see what God is like, we actually like him. Because who wouldn't like a God who loves everybody and invites everybody in and wants the best for everybody and reveals that he's full of grace? Who wouldn't like that? That God came to show us what he was like, that we would like him and want to become like him. That we would become like the God who created us, who revealed himself to us in the person of Jesus, and not just become like God, but listen, become like who you were always, always, always destined and meant to be. And in case we ever lose sight of what God is like, in case we ever get confused about what God is like, John, who spent 3 years, like we said, walking with and learning from Jesus. John, who watched Jesus spend time with people who were nothing like him. John, who watched Jesus, leveraged his power and leveraged his influence, never to force or coerce or threaten, but only ever used his power and his authority and his influence to heal and provide and protect and restore. He watched Jesus consistently leverage his best for the best of others. And John, who listened to Jesus' teachings and heard Jesus' teachings over and over again about love one another and love your neighbor as yourself and love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. And it's better to turn the other cheek because forgiven is better than even. And to care for those in the who is nothing like you, and to be willing to go the extra mile to care for and provide for and protect and restore, to leverage your best for the best of others. John, who'd watched and listened to this for 3 years, after 3 years and then 40 years of thinking about it and praying about it and writing it down, summed it all up in 3 simple words to make it simple for everybody to always remember just what God is like. And he said this: if God is like Jesus, then God is love. If you ever get confused, if you ever lose sight of who God is and who he intended you to be, God is love. And then John, one night, which would turn out to be his last night, having a meal with Jesus. It's the night that Jesus would be betrayed and then condemned and then sent to be nailed to a cross. It was Jesus' last night with his 12 closest followers. And he's preparing them for the fact that he's about to leave and hand the whole mission, the whole everything over to them. And he's trying to make everything as simple as possible as he can for them. To boil it down to the simplest little thing. And he says this. He says, a new command I give you. A new command. Not 600 commands. Not 10 commands. Not even 2 commands. One command. A new command I give you. Love one another. To which they're thinking, that's not new, Jesus. You've been talking about that for 3 years now. You've told us to love one another. You've told us to love our neighbors as ourselves. In fact, Jesus, you even told us to love our enemies. Who does that? This isn't new. And Jesus is like, well, I'm not through. Love one another as I have loved you. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And she's saying, remember how I've loved? Remember how I've always used my power, my authority, my influence, not for myself, not to gain control, not to exert control, not to threaten, but always to heal and help and protect and provide and restore. Remember how my love, I always leveraged my best for the best of others. Remember how I always spent time with people who are nothing like me. Remember how we always went the extra. Remember, you guys have seen how I've loved. Love one another as I have loved you. The same love you've seen me living out is the love that I'm inviting you into. That God and Jesus hadn't just come to show us how much he loves us and how much he's for us, but he's inviting us in to live out the same kind of self-sacrificial, unconditional love. That Jesus is inviting us to align, not just with him, but his way of love, that we would learn to leverage our best for the best of one another, that we would learn to love one another, our neighbor as ourselves, that we would learn to love our enemies. Here's what we know. We know this. This is not a Bible thing. This is not a Christian thing. This is just the way that life works. All of us can look around the world at all the brokenness and all the hurt and all the pain and all the suffering, and we know what fixes it, don't we? It's simple, isn't it? It's love your neighbor as yourself, right? It fixes everything, doesn't it? Everything gets fixed when we love our neighbor as ourselves. All the pain, all the heartbreak, all the rejection, all the trauma, all of it is cured with love your neighbor as yourself, isn't it? And all that pain and all those problems and everything that's wrong as a result of not doing that. And we can look at the people in our lives and the hurts that they've experienced. And we can look back at our own lives and the hurts that we've experienced. We know all of it would be avoidable with love one another. We know all of it could be fixed with love one another. And we know that when we're at our best, that's what we do. It's who we are. And when we think about looking back on our lives and how we're remembered and how people think of us, that's who we want to be, isn't it? You see, love wasn't just a command. Love wasn't a rule. Jesus was coming and saying, this is just how life works. This is how life was meant to work. It's the only way that life can work. And when you live this way, everything works. I'm not inviting you to follow a rule. I'm inviting you to live in alignment with the way that life was created to work. He could have just as easily said, I'm inviting you to align with the principle of gravity. Right? It's just don't walk off the edge of that building because there's a thing called gravity. And it'll pull you to the ground. And I'm inviting you to follow me and live in alignment with the way of gravity. Because when you don't, it hurts you. When you walk off the edge of that building, I'm not punishing you. And when you don't walk off of the edge of that building, I'm not rewarding you. That not respecting gravity comes with its own consequences and rewards. When you align with gravity, life just works better. I'm not upset with you if you don't align with gravity, but I'm glad when you do, because it's good for you. My invitation to align with gravity is not because I need something from you, but because I want something for you. Life works out better when you live in alignment with gravity. Love is not a rule. Love is not a command. Jesus had come to show us that love is the principle of how life works. And he was inviting us to live in alignment with it because life works better. It's the only way that life can work. When we live in alignment with Jesus' way of love. And it's who we were meant to be. It's who you were meant to be. You were created in the image of God who revealed himself in the person of Jesus. God who is love. It's in you. You have that divine potential in you. It's who you were created to be. It's who you were meant to be. And you have that potential inside of you to become someone who loves generously, who loves compassionately, who learns how to leverage your best, everything that makes you you, your past, your experiences, your knowledge, your skills, your gifts, your talents, your abilities, your resources, your failures and your disappointments, as well as your successes, for you to learn how to leverage all of that to elevate the people around you to their best. That's in you. Become compassionate and generous and patient. Someone who moves people towards their best. It's in you. God's planted it in you. And Jesus' invitation, what Jesus came to do, wasn't to constrain us into, not to use rules and punishment and reward to constrain us into something that we're not. but he came to invite us out of the things that hold us back from who we already are, who you already are. It's in you. And Jesus came to free us from the things that hold that back. Because even though that's in us, we know this, don't we? You know this. That potential to love like Jesus loves, it gets snowed over by life, doesn't it? It gets snowed over by hurt. It gets snowed over by habits. It gets snowed over by lies that we believe, and fears, and insecurities, and anxieties. It gets constrained and covered over. And Jesus came not to impose control, but to remove those controls that are holding you back from the potential that God has planted in you. And maybe if you were sitting where John was sitting with Jesus at dinner that night, maybe, you might lean over to Jesus and say, the love idea is great. Self-sacrificial, unconditional love, all for it. It's the right thing. But nobody's going to freely choose to do that. Like, nobody's going to live that way. So Jesus, let me just make a suggestion. We're going to need to put some controls in place. We're going to need to come up with some creative punishments and threats and rewards because nobody's going to do this, to which Jesus would have said, no. Because I have something better in mind. And the next day, Jesus would go to the cross. He'd be arrested, put on mock trial, accused, condemned, and sent to the cross. And God in flesh, the God of the universe, the all-powerful, almighty, all-knowing, all-everything God of the universe would willingly allow his own creation to nail him to a cross without lifting a finger to stop us, to prove forever and always that our God is a God who will always respect and uphold our freedom. Even when we're at our worst, even when it costs him everything, he'll always be a respecter of our freedom. He proved it. And he laid down his life. He gave up everything for us to prove to us beyond a shadow of a doubt that he will always be for us. Because Jesus had in mind something far better, far more effective, far more transformative than control. Control gets people to conform. Jesus came to get people to transform. And what Jesus had in mind was that in seeing his love, and seeing the love that he lived out, and seeing the love that he poured out, and seeing the love that would always respect our freedom, that we would, you would, I would, that we would freely trust him. Trust him. Because what we know about trust is you can't threaten people into trust. You can't offer punishments to get people to trust you, right? You can't force people to trust you. You can't bribe people to trust you. You cannot control people into trust. The only way for trust to be trust is if trust is given freely. And Jesus' invitation is for us to trust him freely. Aria, I skipped a couple slides. And go forward one more. Beautiful. One more. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Jesus, you're like, that's the last one. I appreciate you. Jesus invited us to trust him freely. If it's not free, it's not trust. If we're aligning with Jesus out of fear, if we're aligning with Jesus for reward, it's not trust. Trust is when we're convinced of his goodness, convinced of his way of love, and align with him freely. Jesus invited us to trust him freely, that we would be set free into who we were meant to be. And Jesus came, and he recognized the problem wasn't people that were too free, that needed to be controlled. What Jesus found, what our Creator found, who loved you and died for you, what he found in you was someone who had too much control being exerted. It was holding you back and constraining you from who you were meant to be. And his desire was to win your trust, that you would freely trust him and be freed into who you were always meant to be. And the reason that Key City Church exists, the reason we exist, is to partner with God and free people into their God-given potential through dynamic trust in Jesus. And this is why that's our mission, because it was Jesus' mission. And our goal as a community is to partner with God, partner with Jesus, to free people, to see people set free into their God-given potential. And our heart's desire is for all of you to experience that, is to support and help and encourage everyone in this community to experience that freedom, to become who God created you to be, to experience and engage in your life the way that Jesus always intended you to set you free. And who God and Jesus created you and intended you to be. That's our desire. That's what we want to see. But what does that look like? And how do we do that? How do we get rid of those things that hold us back from who we know we truly are, from who you truly are? That's what we're going to be talking about in the next several weeks. And so we hope that you'll choose to join us next Sunday as we continue in part 3 of Faith for Freedom.